Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm your host Dave Korsunski, my co-host Dr. John Romansky, and we're going to dive in today and talk about therapeutic fasting. Specifically, what we wanted to cover today is how you can practice therapeutic fasting safely and effectively and monitor very carefully. And what we've been working on at Heads Up over the last several years are ways that you can precisely measure what's happening to your health when you're fasting because you're doing things that might be considered extreme. You may be going without food for 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. Sometimes people will do 10 days or more of water fasting. This is something that is not to be taken lightly. So, one of the things we do at Heads Up is we have dashboards to really precisely track vital signs when you're fasting. So, if you're an individual who's doing this, you want to have biofeedback. Make sure you're doing this correctly. Make sure your health is improving. If you're a practitioner, you're going to want to be able to monitor your patients remotely to make sure that they're doing fasting properly. And actually, once you start to learn how to read the numbers, it becomes one of the most rewarding parts. It's really a tool to develop metabolic mastery. So, John, you have a tremendous amount of expertise here. You were the one who roped me into doing my first 10-day water fast. I didn't
You're
really know what
welcome.
I was signing up for, which was actually probably a good thing. But maybe we can just start off with a quick overview on just different types of fasting. Intermittent
hmm
versus like what you would consider more extended, and then maybe like into just therapeutic fasting for cancer and other conditions. Can you just help us break down like the taxonomy there?
Yeah, of course. Good to be with everybody. So, I think the way I kind of approach metabolic health or health in general is you need to have different tools in your repertoire that you can use depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The idea of fasting, I think, has been kind of taboo for a long time until pretty recently, where people started realizing the benefits of not only short-term fasting, time restricted eating, and then the extended fasts. Um, I think Dr. Longo was one of the kind of pioneers in terms of doing the extended fasting, showing the actual mechanisms of action and the actual benefits at a cellular level. He's out of USC. And then obviously the online community has taken over and really kind of shown the benefits. Now, what are the benefits? I mean, beyond just the metabolic benefits, there's the psychological benefits, which I think maybe we start with first, because I think a lot of the way I approach obesity and nutrition in general is I really believe for a lot of individuals, it is no different in terms of addiction than a lot of other things, alcohol, drugs, etc. And one of the psychological components of that is the feeling that you always need to eat. So recently, in the last couple of years, a lot of the weight loss kind of mechanisms, the Ozempic, the Wegovy's, have become popular. And I think one of the reasons that they're very popular is because they suppress your appetite. Now, you can do the same thing with fasting and actually have some extra benefits from that. It's not as easy as taking the Wegovy, Ozempic, or other medications, but you can start controlling the idea of food, which I think for a lot of people is very difficult. But you can really get into this pattern where without always needing to be in a cycle of eating every couple hours because you're hungry or you think you're hungry. So beginning with that, and just doing a time restricted window, I think can help a lot of people just psychologically overcome the idea that they always need to be eating. Um, from kind of a mechanism standpoint, your body is always using energy, no matter what you're doing, if you're sleeping or working out, and you have to fuel that energy. Well, most of that energy for most people comes from glucose or stored glycogen. But if you never really get through those periods of burning through glycogen, which is not 100% true because you don't burn through all your glycogen or you would die, but basically allowing your body to use different sources of energy,
Yeah.
like fat, for instance, you'll never lose weight. And when I say lose weight, I mean you'll never lose fat. So being able to really kind of lower the amount of glycogen, glucose in your system being able to suppress your insulin enough so that you can actually start breaking down fatty acids. That allows you to have a couple things: endless supply of energy from ketone bodies or fatty acids, better hormonal control, so you're not as hungry, and then also your fat distribution, so you start losing more visceral fat, the fat around the belly, which also has a cascade effect because a lot of that fat is very hormonally active, causing high estrogen levels, causing high leptin levels, things that can impact your ability to lose weight or fat in the future. So, like a short term fast, I think, is more of a psychological thing, allows you to get away from having to eat all the time, but also starts to allow you to access some other stores of fat or stores of energy. Now, you get into kind of a sweet spot when you start doing 72 hours. About 72 hours for most people, that's when you start getting more ketone production. And
Hmm.
if you're actually monitoring that with glucose meters, ketone meters, and the GKI, you can see. I mean, you've done it, and I've done it many times, where you can see it's a slow ramp, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's like a big ramp where you go from a ketone, like blood ketone, and maybe a zero point 0.7, zero point 0.8, where you're technically therapeutic, but not really. So all of a sudden you're at a 2.5, and the next day you're at a 4.5. Well, that's because you're really switching the dominant source of energy to the fatty acid, and the byproduct of that is the ketone bodies. And that,
Yeah, we're
depending on
going
the
to look at some
person,
data here in a
yeah,
second, so we'll be able to nerd out on it a little more.
100%. And depending on the person, it depends on how long it takes to get there. But if you are pretty metabolically flexible, I can get there within 2 days of extended fasting. People who maybe have more insulin resistance, it'll take them longer, but they can still get there. And
Yeah.
I think once they get to that period where they start making ketones or using fatty acids, the hunger levels drop significantly. And for a lot of people, finally being able to see, oh, okay, I don't have to eat every 3 to 4 hours like I've been told, allows them psychologically to have more confidence that they're not going to die from doing an extended fast. And then as you progress, beyond that period, the irony is that once you pass 72 hours for most people and you're therapeutic in ketone levels, the hard part is done for the most part. I mean, as you extend, and you can attest to this, you'll have waves of hunger. But really, the really like struggling part is in the first 72 hours for most people. So beyond that, then you're just getting into more of, why are you doing it? Are you doing it for religious purposes? Are you doing it for, severe metabolic disease? Are you doing it because you want to lose a certain amount of fat? I mean, I think it depends on the goal that people have, but you can extend for a significant amount of time.
Yeah, so a couple things I wanted to just dig into there. I'll ask a lot of like the layman questions, but
Sure.
one of the things I've noticed is that the first two times I did an extended fast, it was hard,
Hmm.
and the more I practice now, it's actually easier. So there's got to be some
100%.
adaptation that is happening that seems to make this much easier the more you practice it. Is that related to one's level of insulin resistance, or is it some kind of adaptation where the body starts to learn to more easily switch between glucose and ketone? What
Hmm.
actually starts to make it easier? Because it does get
Yep.
easier.
It does, and you're right. And for some reason, I don't see you on the video anymore. Are you sure your video is working?
Uh,
I hear you. Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So, couple thoughts on that. Number one, I think the psychological component is the main thing.
sure.
So, knowing that you're not going to die within the first whatever 10 hours, 12 hours, 18 hours, etc. So I think psychologically, that's the biggest hurdle for most people is knowing that you will be able to make it through, not just from like a energy perspective that you're going to go hypoglycemic or feel like you're going to pass out, but from actually, um, I think it's the reassurance of most people knowing that they've done it before and knowing kind of what to expect. Because I mean, doing it the first time, you have no idea what to expect. People can tell you, yeah, around this period you're going to have hunger, you're going to have thirst, you're going to feel a little, you're going to have a keto flu or a flu kind of symptoms. So I think having the experience of going through it before allows you to really have an easier time subsequently. That's number one. I think number two, also though, I don't recommend that most people go from a Western diet eating, high carbs to going into a fast because I think
Hmm.
that becomes very, very difficult.
That's rough.
Um, Very difficult. And I actually tell people not to do that because I think in general, my experience has been that people will have a very negative thought on fasting going forward.
Yeah, the
So,
body's really cranky if you've not at
uh,
least done some low
yeah,
carbing dieting
yeah.
for ketosis beforehand.
Most people, I'll tell them if they've never done any kind of low carb keto or just whole foods, do it for 7 days, or I'll do like an egg fast for a couple days where they're just eating eggs, and then transition into a fast. And then also on that point, I usually will not tell people to jump into an extended fast right away because I don't think the body is ready for it psychologically or physically. But going back to your question, um, yeah, I mean, once people are dedicated enough to do fasting, it tends to also allow them to like really start eating healthy as well. And that doesn't have to be low carb keto, but I have found that most people, when they get that window where they feel therapeutically well, especially when their ketones are high, and they start to feel better, they're sharper, whatever aches and pains they have are getting better. It's really a positive reinforcement for most people to actually start eating healthier. And then once you start doing that and you're having lower insulin levels, you're having better control of your glucose spikes, you're starting to lose that visceral fat that I mentioned. So hormonally, you're starting to get better because we talk a lot about insulin resistance, but we don't talk much about leptin resistance, which I think is probably on par with insulin in terms of um, causing it to be difficult for people to lose fat. They don't feel hungry, they don't feel full ever, and that becomes an issue. So you start to get suppression of those levels. People start to have an idea of what it feels like to feel good again, and then I think metabolically they're starting to get healthier, so the subsequent fasts tend to be a lot easier for them.
Well, what I'd like to do, John, is get into some specifics here and actually look at some data. And maybe you can
Yep.
just take us through. I just finished a 72-hour fast this past weekend, and I'd say it's maybe the sixth or seventh one I've done.
Hmm.
72 hour. That just seems to be my sweet spot. Although I'll say on this one, I was at the 72-hour mark and I felt amazing.
Yep.
I would have kept going, but there was a family dinner that I wanted to attend, so I chose to tap out at 72. But I feel absolutely phenomenal when I'm fasting. And
Yep.
it's counterintuitive for me to say this, but I feel better. I think better. I'm more creative. I'm better at sports. Everything is better when I haven't eaten for 2 days, which,
Hmm.
if you've never fasted before, sounds absolutely insane. But it's actually how I
Yeah.
feel. So let's take a look at some of the numbers here. Let's
Okay.
see.
There are a few questions you want to answer them.
I can't see them, John. Can you take them?
Okay. Yeah, sure. So let's see. So Greg Jackson. Hey, Greg. I think he was going to do it after lunch because he's hungry. So, all right. So, one question: how do we know which therapeutic fast is best for us? I've seen fresh juice fast, coffee fast, goat milk fast, water fast, etc. Yeah. So, great question. A lot of fad kind of fasts out there. I have found that the water with salt or electrolyte fast is the most efficient, but also the easiest, which is kind of counterintuitive. But um, the reason for that, and sometimes I will cheat on my fast with some espresso, so I have to put that caveat out there. But the reason for that is because if let's take a juice fast for example, which I think is actually one of the hardest fasts to do, because you are basically what are you doing? Well, you're getting some calories from the juice, right? So it's not really technically a fast, but you're also not suppressing your insulin levels at that point because you're still getting the spike from the juice, whatever the juice is. Now, some people will say, well, celery juice, etc. But even with those, you'll still get a spike in glucose, spike in insulin. So what you're trying to accomplish, which is production of, I mean, we measure ketone bodies, but that's really a byproduct of what we're trying to accomplish, which is you suppress insulin, which allows for an enzyme to break down the fatty acids. So you're getting that energy to your brain because your brain doesn't like the ups and downs. So the reason that if you eat like, let's say, a huge pasta dish, and then 30 minutes later you're like passed out on the couch, the reason for that is because you get a massive glucose spike followed by a massive insulin spike, and then the glucose gets shoved into whatever fat, tissues, etc.
Your love
You get a
handles.
drop in your glucose, and then your brain is like, "Hey, man, I don't have any energy." When you're fasted or metabolically adapted, where you are using fatty acids, then your brain doesn't have that up and down, and so that's why you feel sharp because you're having a constant source of energy. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's, I would say, kind of the overall gist of it. So now, when you're doing any of those other fasts, you're not really suppressing your insulin enough to get those ketone bodies. You may eventually, if you do it long enough. So I have found that people don't have good success with those fasts at all. They feel miserable. They're hungry all the time. Versus, as you mentioned, after 72 hours, I mean, you could continue, but socially, you need to do something else. So I think that's. I usually don't do those other fasts or don't recommend them.
Yeah, for me, it's just water, electrolytes,
Hmm.
green tea.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's perfect. And then the pre-fast program, yeah, I mean, I think again we kind of went over that a little bit in terms of I tend to recommend that people do some sort of a low carb keto. I mean, I still feel the easiest is just egg fast. Eat 12 eggs a day for 3, 4 days, and then after that jump into a fast. And people tend to have good success with that.
Yeah, the only ones I've done are just straight water and electrolytes. Mainly, what I'm looking to do is cellular autophagy, which
Yeah.
is a process of just eliminating any cells that are not performing at 100%.
Hmm.
Also, maximum downward metabolic pressure. To me, the most interesting part is understanding what happens to your body when you do it. And
Hmm.
so I will typically go with just water fast, and it kind of like leads into what I want to show here. So, John, can you see my screen?
I can. Let me just answer one more thing for Greg
Yeah, go for
because
it.
he did say something about the 9 day goat milk fast, which again I think would probably. I have never done that. I don't have experience with that, so take that with a grain of salt. But I would say that with that one, you probably are not getting the significant surge in insulin, and so it's not going to cause that kind of cycle that you're experiencing. And goat fat tends to not be as inflammatory as cow fat. So or cow milk. So I think that's probably partially why. Okay, sorry, Dave. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So you're doing this, right? You're not going to eat for days. You really want to understand what's happening to your body. You want to understand and make sure you're doing this correctly. And actually, some of the changes in the numbers are absolutely fascinating. So if you're an
Hmm.
individual and you're looking to track your fast, starting to master these numbers is the key to developing complete 100% mastery over your metabolism. If you're a practitioner and you want to monitor people remotely, these are the biometrics you want to look at. So the first one you want to do is just, this is simple. This is just actually starting to time the fast.
Hmm.
And it's simple. You click start, you punch in the amount of hours. So you can see here I started May 18, 7:46 p.m. And this is helpful because you can just get a sense of how much elapsed time. So easy, just a simple fasting timer. This is on web and mobile, and you just set it for the duration.
Hmm.
Pretty self-explanatory. The next one, though, is starting to monitor blood sugar while you're fasting. And John, as you know, I'll share a few results here. You can see that I started at around 86. Actually, these numbers are not the original ones. I went down from 69, 74, 60, 61. Let me pull up the
Hmm.
exact numbers here. Where is glucose? Keto mojo. So here's what happened to my blood sugar. You can see before the
Hmm.
fast, I was at 83. Okay, the first 24 hours, you're still running on your body's glucose stores. So
Hmm.
the glucose isn't coming down too much. Like you said, John, your body's got whatever, 36 hours of glucose in the tank, basically.
Hmm.
So you start the fast here, nothing happening. Once you burn through your your glucose reserves, you can see it's immediately going to start dropping off a cliff. So I went from 86 on the 20th at 10:56 a.m. And then by 5 p.m. that day, I was down to 69.
Hmm.
And then you can see I went up a bit. This was after exercise, so it
Hmm.
always comes up a bit. But then down towards the end of the fast, I'm down in the low 60s, which you would think would be serious because that's a low number. But you can see the ketones, it's the exact opposite.
Hmm.
You know, the
Hmm.
ketones start off pretty low and they just basically start to take over as the dominant fuel source. So you
Hmm.
can see initially your body's running on glucose, very low ketones. By the end of the fast, it's completely inverted. And so that's where you start to measure these numbers. So I'm measuring my blood sugar throughout the fast and checking it every 6 hours. And
Hmm.
I'm starting to watch it come down. I'm really looking to get it down into the low 60s. And then I'm also starting to test ketones. I was using the Keto Mojo on this experiment, and you can see the ketones starting to pop up. So
Yep.
when you start to test, you see these numbers. This is your body. You're witnessing your body start to burn through glucose reserves and start to run on ketones, and you're doing this in a safe, supported, healthy environment. And then I'm also monitoring this, which is a little bit more of an advanced metric, and you can chime in here, John, in a second. But it's the glucose ketone ratio, also called the glucose ketone index, or you may have seen it called the GKI for
Hmm.
short. But it's looking at the ratio of glucose to ketones. And when I'm fasting, what I'm looking to do is push that ratio down as low as possible. I really want to be at maximum ketone, low glucose. What I'm going for is maximum downward metabolic pressure. And
Hmm.
you can see the ratio of glucose to ketones is increasingly lower. So this just means there's more ketones powering the body than there is glucose. So just to pull the
Yep.
glucose ketone index on the map. And if you're doing this for cancer or epilepsy or what you would call certain psychiatric disorders,
Hmm.
you want to get the glucose ketone index as low as possible. You're pushing all the glucose out of the cell. And in Thomas Seyfried's research from what university does he work for in Boston? It's escaping me now. But he saw the best results on the cancer program when the GKI
Hmm.
was as low as possible. So for me, when I'm fasting, I want to get this number to 3 or below, stay there as long as I can, start doing like zone 2 cardio training, and just starting to maximize fat burn.
Yep.
So comments on that, John, like just how these numbers work and anything you'd add to
100%.
that?
Yeah, if you go back to the graph of the malt, I think that's the best one. Yeah. So let's just quickly let's start off with the glucose. So, I mean, you're starting at a really good glucose level to begin with, right? So you're in the 80s, which shows that you're already metabolically, pretty dialed in. Which you and I have talked about that. You've been really focusing on all the biohacks and nutrition, et cetera. So you're starting from a good place. Now, if you were starting from, like we mentioned, kind of a Western diet, high carb, and when I say high carb, I'm talking more like the refined, pizza, hamburger, things like that. You're going to start from a much higher glucose level. Now, in your body circulating, there's very, very little glucose, right? But you can have a pretty good amount of glycogen storage, which, the old adage was prior to any sort of like endurance athletics, you would carb load the night before, right? I'm sure
Yep.
people who have done sports, everybody's done that, pasta the night before. And the idea behind that is you're going to increase your glycogen stores by maybe 15%. So you have extra fuel. But then while you're exercising in a race, whatever, you see people hitting the glucose gels, et cetera, the sports drinks, because they're trying to replenish that glucose glycogen storage. But a lot of the research that has been done in terms of nutrition is really done from the athletic side, where some of the professors and MDs who have really researched this have shown you can have improved performance if you are low carb or keto because you have such an endless supply of ketone bodies and fatty acids. So it's really changed the paradigm in terms of how we think of nutrition and athletics. But just like overall big picture, yes, you are burning through your glycogen stores, and then if you pull up the ketone levels, that'd be helpful. And then what I like about data is not just the data per se, is that you can visualize it, which I think I'm a very visual learner and a lot of people are. So you can see the crossover period where all of a sudden
Yep.
you have higher ketone levels than glucose. Obviously, it's
Yep.
not one to one, but that in if you were to actually jot a note and say, okay, well, how am I feeling at that point? You could probably say at that point I'm feeling pretty good, mental clarity,
I
sleep
was
is
euphoric.
improving.
When
Yeah,
I get into these levels, I'm completely euphoric.
exactly. And look at the suppression of your glucose, which again is telling you you're always going to use glucose. So the idea that you're just running on fatty acids is obviously false, and that's not the point. The point is, are you now metabolically more flexible because you have multiple energy sources, which you do. And then for people who are trying to lose weight, obviously you're burning fat significantly at that point, which is an added benefit. And then pull up the GKI real fast because I wanted to mention something about that. Now, and some of the research that I think is probably the most powerful, I mean, you talked about cancer, which, yes, there's a significant advantage. Fasting, some cancers are not glucose dominant. So you have to be careful
That's right.
saying that
Yeah.
if you fast, you're going to suppress cancer. Yeah, maybe. But I think the power of fasting with cancer specifically is a lot of research has been showing that the side effects of chemotherapy is significantly reduced. So the nausea, the vomiting, the fatigue tends to
Makes
be
sense.
significantly reduced. But in things like mental disorders, so obviously there's a huge surge in mental disorders now, but I think some of the more promising research in fasting and the ability to improve bipolar and schizophrenia is when you give people very, very therapeutic and ketosis. So I would say the GKI at this point, for me, I would use it significantly for cancer and then for mental disorders, bipolar, schizophrenia, more specifically. Um,
Yeah, just on that note, John, there's the Metabolic Health Summit, which is
mhm.
one of the premier academic conferences of the year, where they look at the latest scientific developments in
Yep.
metabolic health. And there's more and more research coming to market around deep therapeutic ketosis for mental health disorders,
Yep.
specifically, like you mentioned, bipolar, schizophrenia, epilepsy. So there's something about dysregulated metabolism,
Hmm.
and there's something about deep therapeutic ketosis that works for some of these conditions. They're calling it,
Hmm.
what's the name for it? It's oh man, I can't remember the name,
Yeah.
psychiatry or something
Yeah.
like that. But there's more of this evidence that keto responds extremely well for certain psychiatric conditions. So it's really exciting to see this as a new therapy for a lot of really difficult to treat mental health disorders.
Hmm. Well, if you think about it just intuitively, and this is kind of big picture, if you're having dysregulation, and it doesn't matter where you're having it, that part of the organ is not going to be functioning properly. So if you're having dysregulation in parts of the brains that are really dependent on neurotransmitter, and you have this massive inflation or inflammation, that part of the brain is not going to be functioning properly, essentially. And so suppressing that inflammation, because when you're using ketones for fuel, which is mostly for the brain, and the heart can use it too, the byproduct of that is less reactive oxidative species, ROSs. So you have less inflammation in that part of the brain. And so, big picture would be you're having less inflammation in the part of the brain that is inflamed, obviously. And so your symptoms tend to improve. Now, obviously, there's a lot more detailed research in terms of the mechanisms behind that, but that's what I would take away from that. There was one question real fast I just want to go back to from Brody. Thanks for joining us. So the question is, I've read some studies on the 7-day water fast to remove damaged cells, etc. Will a 3-day fast provide the same outcomes? Also, any fear of muscle loss during long fast? So those are some great questions. Now, so Dave kind of mentioned the autophagy, which is autophagy is just a fancy word for saying that we remove the dead cells. Now, that process is always happening, right? So if you like twist your ankle and you get a huge swelling, what's happening? Your body inflammatory responses going in and cleaning out whatever was damaged and repairing it. Now, what we're talking about at autophagy, though, is more like cellular level. And specifically, we look at a couple things. So, number one, your immune system goes through a significant autophagy when you're fasting, especially the extended fast. And that helps in terms of obviously your immune system and cancer surveillance, et cetera. And then at the mitochondrial level, you actually get significant removal of mitochondria that are not functioning and production of new mitochondria, which mitochondria basically battery cell of all our organs. And when you mentioned Thomas Siegfried, his theory is that a lot of cancer is due to dysfunctional metabolism at a mitochondrial level. So the
Yep.
idea is that you're improving basically energy production, which allows for better function of cells. Now, the timing of that, it's not definitive where it's okay at 72 hours you start having it. It's always happening. Basically, what you're doing though with the extended fast is you're allowing your body uh, to not spend so much energy on actually dealing with the food that you're bringing in. So a lot of the energy is now being used to maximize autophagy. Studies have been showing that you can do a dry fast, which is nothing, no water, no electrolytes, no food, and you will ramp up the autophagy significantly. I'm not a big fan of dry fast. I think they're dangerous. I'm sure I'll get a lot of comments about that. I just don't think it's something that I would ever practice, and I don't recommend it to people. So to answer the question, I would say it's accelerating the longer you're doing it. And then the last part of that question was any fear for muscle loss. So no, there have been a ton of studies that have shown DEXA scans before, after extended fast that show that the majority of weight loss is fat and water. And so when you go back after you stop an extended fast, you will gain weight, and most of that is just water going back because your muscles are reabsorbing water with the glycogen that's being replenished. But in terms of muscle loss, that's one of the benefits of the fasting is you really don't get protein or muscle loss versus with a lot of diets, which are calorie restricted diets, where you do lose weight, but a lot of that weight is actually muscle and bone density along with the fat. So it's that's another added benefit of doing fasting versus calorie restricted diets.
Yeah, there's an amazing video out there that really does like honestly like an animated cartoon explanation of all the
Mm-hmm.
biochemistry of a 72-hour fast. It's awesome. It's on YouTube. I'll share it here. A couple of the things, John, before we jump back to the data. One,
Yep.
another way to look at doing these 72-hour water fasts for me is like almost as a cancer prevention because it's just killing off a lot of senescent cells anyhow. So you could look at it almost as like a disease mitigation strategy. I just do it because I feel incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I actually believe that you're probably going to see increased growth hormone when you're
You do.
fasting because
Yeah.
elevated insulin levels is going to suppress growth hormone. So I feel my energy levels, my muscles, everything actually getting stronger when I'm fasting. So I'd say if anything, it's a way to increase lean mass. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of asterisks with that. You have to do it properly. But I would say the inverse is true, where actually for me, it's a technique to improve body composition. Anyhow, in the interest of time, let's jump back here. I
Yeah.
just want to get your input on a couple of the metrics, John, when I'm fasting. So
Sure.
obviously, looking at sleep, are you getting good quality, deep, restful sleep?
Mm-hmm.
And as your insulin levels come down, your blood sugar is really low, your resting heart rate is really low before bed. You're not going in like an elevated glucose state. My sleep is really, really good. So these were the sleep numbers while I was fasting.
Yep.
Just absolutely a lot of deep, a lot of REM. More importantly, those heart rate variability. And there was some interesting patterns in the HRV that I want to share here. So I'm going to clear the report and I want to just look at the HRV. Let me just take these off the graph.
Yep.
And this is how I calibrate. I want to look at the HRV from Aura. There it is. So you can see that as I was going into the fast, I was at about 37 after the first night, so I'm feeling pretty good. Night two and night three, my HRV actually went down. So you can see this is
Mm-hmm.
putting a little bit of a stressor on the body. I'm
Mm-hmm.
48 hours fasted here. Okay, 24 hours fasted, 48 hours fasted. So heart rate variability, it's basically a level of the stress load on the body. And this is why you want to monitor, because if this number kept going down, I would see that I'm putting an this is what you would call a healthy stressor. I'm doing this intentionally, but I want to make sure I'm not putting too much stress load on the body.
Mm-hmm.
So I monitored this and I said, okay, night two, I'm a little lower. I dropped pretty significantly. I was still sleeping really well. My energy levels were amazing, so I still felt great. If my HRV had tanked and I started feeling tired and nauseous and headache and fatigue, I'd probably stop the fast.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons you want to get some data, calibrate that with how you feel, and if you don't feel good, tap out. And you can always start again. But here my HRV went down, fine. I still feel great, still feel great. And then you can see as soon as I came out of the
Mm-hmm.
fast, immediately I popped back up to 40, and now I'm 2 days after the fast, my HRV is climbing way higher than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
So responding well, stressor on the body, still feeling good, but this biofeedback helped me identify, okay, this is stressor here, pay attention. I
Mm-hmm.
still felt great, and then bam, you see it start to pop up from there. So comments on HRV while fasting, Doc.
Yeah. So if you go back, I think you also did some exercise that day where it
Yep,
dropped.
yep,
When your glucose spiked.
yep.
Now, I mean, what you're talking about is hormesis, which is, an acute stressor. So most of the things that we do biohacking wise are hermetic stressors. So, sauna, ice bath, um, hit or exercise training, fasting, those are all hormesis basically. So it's a good stressor. Now, you may see an initial drop in your HRV, but as you mentioned, it kind of
Which I did.
plateaued down there, right?
Yep.
And then once you go back, and we should probably talk about, the fast is very important, but when you get out of a fast, that's equally important what you do, because that's when you have kind of a clean slate where you can start repairing a lot of the things that were being removed. So
Well,
new
you can see it right
immunity, new
here.
muscle cells, etc. So you're obviously not just going, hey, I'm going to fast for 72 hours and then I'm going to go eat a pizza and drink some beer. You're using that as a
Smells pretty good.
tool. Yeah, we should start that kind of fast. But you're using it as a tool to reset your system, as you mentioned, do the autophagy, and then rebuild the new cells. So, I mean, I think that graph looks great. The other thing, if you go back to the sleep, one thing that I've noticed with sleep is yes, the deep and the REM usually will go up
Well,
significantly.
let's look at that. I didn't actually
Yeah,
look at that. Let's look at the deep.
yeah, because one of the biggest impedance for people to achieve good sleep is food.
Here it is right here,
Ironically,
John. This
yep,
was night
yeah,
two of the fast. Bang. Deep sleep went
look at
up
that.
big time, right? I
Yeah,
had 102 minutes of deep
yeah,
on night
which is
two, and my
great.
baseline is 80.
Yeah, yeah,
There it is
and I'm
right
sure
there.
REM was probably similar. But one of the suppressors of melatonin is actually eating late at night. So your gut actually makes melatonin, and if you're eating late at night, that suppresses it pretty significantly. And so what I've noticed for myself and a lot of people is not like right away, but as you do an extended fast, you'll see the deep will go up significantly. I've been to the point where I'll get 3.5 hours of deep sleep, 3 hours of REM sleep. But for me and for a lot of my patients, the amount of sleep decreases significantly. So you'll
Yeah, I've
have
seen that
like,
as well. Yeah, you're
because the
just,
light sleep, it's
yeah,
almost like
let's
you
take
don't
a
need it
look.
anymore. Yeah. So your deep and your REM tend to go up, and then the overall tends to actually go down because I
Yeah.
think it's just an efficiency where you're getting everything you need, and so you're ready to go. Um, yeah. So I
Couple
think the
others
sleep
here, John.
is extremely important to look at. Yeah.
We do have a way just to like report your hunger through the fast. This is
Hmm.
really interesting for people who are new at this. It's intellectually challenging to say that after 72 hours of no food, I don't feel hungry and I feel amazing. So I'll check in with hunger. I'll also be carefully tracking hydration. And
Yep.
I'll just come in here and enter, and I'm looking for at least 96, 128 ounces of water with electrolytes per day. And then this is not relevant here. Also tracking weight and body fat. On
Hmm.
a 72-hour fast, you're going to lose 1 to 2 pounds of fat if you're lucky. So
Yeah.
if you're looking to say, I got 10 pounds of fat I want to lose, it's not going to happen in one 72-hour fast. But this fasting is a technique. And as you get better at these 72-hour fasts, they become easier and more enjoyable. And so now I can do something I enjoy over a nice quiet weekend and drop 1 to 2 pounds of fat. And I'll
Hmm.
do that 3 or 4 times to reach ideal body composition and then back off. And then there's other fun things you can stack in. You can stack in sauna, you can stack in ice bath, you can stack in other types of biohacks in there and start to see how those affect the numbers. Maybe
Hmm.
you'll actually see your HRV start to increase during your fasts as you start to layer in some of the health optimization modalities. But I'd say if you're just getting into this, we threw a lot of data at you. Definitely track the duration, start to measure your glucose, start to measure your ketones, understand the GKI. It's really, really important. This is true metabolic mastery when you can control these numbers at will, which is what fasting is. That's longevity. You know, John,
Yep.
longevity as a buzzword is thrown around all over the place. Like, can you control your own blood sugar? That's like longevity number one. And can
Yep.
you control your HRV? Okay, like let's just start there before we get all crazy with like longevity. Like, do you even know your average blood sugar over the last 90 days? That's
Yeah.
longevity. Do you know your HRV? That's longevity. So start to learn these numbers. Fasting is amazing. I love it. So 72 hours, I'm just flying. So anyhow, those are some of the numbers I wanted to share, John. Maybe any closing comments and any other questions we have coming in on the chat.
Yeah. Just a few comments, and then I'll read through a few questions. There was an article. I think it was Business Insider, where there's a tech millionaire who's spending, or billionaire who's spending like millions of dollars to, live as long as possible. He's one of those guys. And the reality is you don't need to spend millions of dollars. All you need is a glucose monitor, a ketone monitor, a heads up dashboard, and, fasting. And you can,
Throw an aura ring
you,
in there, John. Come on.
an Oura ring, and you can essentially have more data and actually do better than, taking some young person's blood or whatever the new fad is these days.
Fecal matter transplants.
Yeah, which is fascinating, but it's true. No, that'll be the next thing. Will be fecal matter for all kinds of disorders.
Yeah.
You'll see. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a great tool to have, um, as we mentioned initially, in your repertoire of things to achieve health. Now, will you lose some fat? Yes. Is it a good way to do it before like your wedding? Yeah, maybe. But I think the metabolic benefits far outweigh the ability to lose fat. Plus, I think it also empowers people to have control over their health, which I think is essential, especially in these days.
Yeah, I just want to
Um,
add one thing there, John, if I may.
yep.
You know, we're at Heads Up. We're not dogmatic about any of this stuff. Last week, John and I talked about how to use GLP-1 weight loss drugs, and like if that's the tool you want to use, rock on. And we just said, if you're going to do that, here's the things you should measure to make sure you're doing it safely. Here we're talking about fasting as a tool for body composition. Next week, we'll talk about keto. I mean, there's lots of ways to get to your goal. The main thing is to make sure you're doing it safely and effectively. Pick your tool. We cover them all here. What we're trying to do is just show you how to measure it properly or help your patients measure it properly.
Hmm.
The most rewarding thing for a patient is when they see those numbers improve right in front of their eyes. That's where the dashboard comes in. So I just wanted to throw that in there, John. We've talked about everything from weight loss drugs to fasting here, and we're
Hmm.
not dogmatic about any approach as long as you're doing it safely and your numbers are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important because I think science, medicine, health is something that is continuously evolving. If we were still practicing back in the day, we would be putting leeches on people for psychiatric disorders. So I mean,
Pass
you
on
have
that one.
to you have to continuously evolve as your knowledge improves and the science
Yeah.
improves. So, but I do think what you and I share is the belief that having data allows you to have that biofeedback that you need to basically say, is this working or is this not working? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's more powerful than just theory because you actually see it in the numbers. Um, Let me just see if there's anything else question wise.
Oh, there's one
Oh,
question about BCAAs or
yeah.
exogenous ketones. I want to say that I love stacking exogenous ketones on my fasts.
Hmm.
I use the HVMN. Ketone 8 is another good one, but as soon as I start fasting, I have those on hand. It's a smooth entry
Yep.
into ketosis, and the euphoric benefits are higher. So for LinkedIn user, there's no name there. I
Yep.
don't use BCAAs, but I do use exogenous ketones on my fast. I love it.
Yeah. I would agree. So, I think I will use them especially in an extended fast. Now,
Hmm.
I think what you do is you get that smooth transition, makes it a little bit easier, as you mentioned. People will say, well, if you're taking exogenous ketones, you're suppressing your endogenous ketones. Not really.
The fasting police, they've always
Yeah,
got something for you.
yeah.
Whatever.
You're always doing it wrong. It's like you're always doing it wrong.
I
It's like
love it,
being a
man.
parent.
I
It's
don't
like
care what
being a
anyone
parent.
says. It feels
But
10 times better.
yeah, and I think it allows you to get to that period where you can get your own endogenous production high enough where you don't need them. So I won't do it the whole extended fast, but first 2 days or so, yeah, I would say that. The BCAAs, I'm not a big fan of them in general. So would they suppress your own fasting production? Probably not, unless you're just hammering heavy amounts. Again, the lean muscle issue I don't think is a significant issue unless you're going extended fast. Now, if you get past 21 days, now you're probably getting into a period where you may need to be a little bit more careful with that, especially if you don't have a lot of body fat. So if you're like morbidly obese, probably not big of an issue. But if you are still 10% body fat and doing it more for therapeutics, then extended wise, you may get into an issue. So that's why.
Yeah, I
Um,
do
yeah.
72 because I think it's got the right mix of therapeutic. It's
Hmm.
also got the right mix of just like getting a couple extra pounds of body fat off.
Yep.
It's right in the sweet spot for me if I feel good the whole time. I can do it over a weekend. I just don't have
Yep.
a lot going on. So I'll pick a weekend where I'm just home. I'll do a lot of like zone 2 cardio training. So I just try to find that sweet spot. Although I felt so good after this one at 72, I might do 96 next time. So everyone just, find the sweet spot that works for you. Like you said, John, if you're dealing with morbid obesity, you're at the extreme edge of type 2 diabetes, that's where
Yep.
Jason Fung's work came in. And he would just immediately put you on a 10-day fast. So it really all depends on your starting point.
Yeah. And especially if you're going to do something like that, you're going to want to do it with a healthcare provider who knows what they're doing. You don't want to do it on your own. But the 72-hour ones, I think, I agree with you. I think they're more feasible, especially in kind of normal day to day living. It's hard
Yeah.
to do 7 to 10 days, especially if you have a family or if you let's say you're a business person and you have to do lunches, etc. It becomes more of a challenge. But 72 hours, you can knock that out pretty easily with nobody even noticing.
Yeah, I was trying to find that video that JLD shared with us on the 72-hour fast. I wanted to link to
Hmm.
it. I'll dig it up here and
Yeah.
I'll share it. But anyhow, the point of today's episode was fasting is fun, it's safe,
Yep.
it's effective, there's incredible health benefits, but it's even safer and more effective when you know how to properly measure it. And that's the dashboard we shared today. If you're an individual, you can sign up, headsuphealth.com, build your own fasting dashboard. If you're a practitioner and you want to run fasting programs and be able to have biofeedback from patients, we have professional edition available. And as always, John, thanks for the medical expertise. I come at it from the technology side, so it's always good to jam with you on these topics. And next week we'll be back. We'll be switching gears next week, talking about blood work and how you can use Heads Up to really streamline getting all of those patient portals and PDFs. There's so much incredible data in lab results, and it's so fragmented that it's almost a tragedy that it's so hard
Hmm.
to see a trend line on your lab. So we have some really powerful ways to solve that. That's going to be our topic next week. Let's see if we got anything else in here, John. I think that was it. Parting
Yeah.
shots, Dr. Lemansky.
No, I mean, I think it's always great jamming with you, and obviously, none of this should be taken as medical advice, but for informational purposes. But I think the more that people take control over their health, the better we're going to be as a society. So, do it smart, have the data, track the data, and best of luck to everybody.
Talk to you next week, John.
All right, sounds good.